We're running behind. This session is going to go through 3:30. So we will skip coffee break, but you can always get coffee at any point. And so without ado, you can start with your presentation. I'll just
Yes, we're in the sunroom, so that's good. So I'm going to be walking you through a bit more of detail in terms of how humanitarian OpenStreetMap team carries out mapping. We do our mapping primarily through what we call community-centered mapping, and that's the let me say the core component or the core infrastructure through which we conduct our mapping. And then, of course, there is a technology aspect of it, which is a combination of AI, mobile data collection tools, etc., all brought together. So there's a community aspect, and then there's a technology aspect. And then typically there's often the partnership aspect of where we are conducting any mapping. So our processes are largely centered around that. So I'm going to be sharing what that process looks like for us, what we've learned through that process. If there's any questions at any point, feel free to stop me or to wait until the end of the presentation, and then we can have any questions. And then I think we've interacted quite a lot the whole day, so with each other. But if you have a question, it would also be good to identify yourself and take that opportunity to tell us about yourself. So I'm hoping to journey through three things: our experience in mapping, particularly in high-risk contexts. Often as a community organization or a technology organization, we face a lot of challenges when it comes to mapping, when there's conflict or when it's fully considered high-risk context. And then I'll share about some instances of where AI collaborations have worked for us and where they haven't worked for us. And then there's a chance for anyone to share about their interventions in their organizations that are relevant to the topic of today. So a bit of context about HOT as an organization. So we are focused on closing map data gaps and very specifically focusing on the 1 billion people, the lower 1 billion people in the world that are missing on the map. And the goal is to bridge that gap so that missing maps are not an issue when it comes to humanitarian response or even development challenges. So we facilitate creation of maps, we create maps, but all this is so that we're able to create reliable map data and high quality map data. Those are the two kind of end goals that we seek to achieve through the process. And then the other thing that I'd like maybe to mention about HOT as an organization is, on to the next slide, sorry, is the concept of local knowledge. So we have what we call the base map, which I'll explain a bit what it is all about. But the community aspect is to embed local knowledge onto the map. So if you have your roads, if you have your buildings, what additional features can you add to that data that is the knowledge of the people that are actually living in that particular location? And then we are open source. So one of the challenges we encounter is there's no business model for companies to do that, to add local knowledge on the map. And AI as well cannot gather the local information that we need gathered. So we do all this through a platform, OpenStreetMap, which is a free editable map of the world. And these are some of the data sets that you can actually add onto OpenStreetMap or that you can find on OpenStreetMap. So we have two levels of data or two classifications. So the first one is what we call base layers for mapping. And so this is the, let me call it the back end. It's the infrastructure, it's the buildings, it's the road. And then we have other additional now layers that are shift more towards advanced local knowledge mapping, where you could have programmatic data that's very specific to a program. You could have different spatial models or context monitoring, depending on what the context is. So these are the two kind of extreme ends around which our data tends to sit in. I think we can skip that. So, of course, we are community-centered. We do a lot of community mapping. One of the biggest real-life challenges we encounter is questions on the credibility of community-sourced data. The trust in community-collected data, that often comes up. And so we have some principles that we work with. So one has to be open and accessible, has to be useful and usable data. We really do try to ensure there is a cause for which we are mapping. Even though there are pretty open avenues where communities can self-mobilize and they can map for their own self-interest, but we do try as an organization to ensure that we are defining a really clear cause as to why we are mapping, whether that's related to an existing humanitarian crisis or that's related to a development project. And then we have a data and protection framework that I'm going to talk a bit about in the next slide. So we look at a fragile context or high-risk context as contexts that bring about accumulation or a combination of so many of risks that are as a result of underlying, let me say, combined or insufficient coping capacity of a given location, and whether that's putting strain on a system, whether that's putting strain on a community to be able to manage those risks. So that's when we say for us, that's considered a fragile context for humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. So this is a map that shows countries where we work in, but also countries that are considered fragile states, from extreme levels to situations that are considered everyday occurrences with a bit of disruption here and there, depending on the context. We also abide by a do no harm principle. So we generally ensure and require of our community to ensure that our activities, the data we create, the data we keep, the data we share to external platforms, whether it's HDX or any other platform, that no one is harmed by that data. So that's the other process that we are there to. And for us, harm is largely categorized into 4 areas, depending on the kind of data we collect. So one, is it likely to increase vulnerability or likelihood of attacks? So for example, if there is conflict in a given situation and mapping, depending on political factions, is that likely to increase vulnerability of attack on one side? Is it likely to bring stigmatization? Of course, PII becomes critical. So a lot of the data, when I share the 2 different data sets, we try to avoid a lot of personal identifying information, and then anything that's likely to bring about economic losses. And the economic losses is largely also because we work with a lot of youth mapper groups, and this means employment or economic processes are really critical for them in their day-to-day work. Moving forward. So this is what we look at in our case. We look at the context and we classify it as green, yellow, red, the map that we saw before. If it's extreme red through and through, conflict or humanitarian setting. If it's green on the other extent, it's stable, peaceful. So we go through a process of assessing the data that we're trying to collect. If it's sensitive data, are there any additional risk factors, et cetera, until we have a full context and risk analysis that then informs how we move forward in terms of collaborating with the communities or actually setting up mapping projects as an organization. So you can see what we refer to as the red. Most of what is in the red, our intervention has been quite limited from a community mapping perspective. And there's more community mapping as we move towards the green side of things. So from where we have interstate wars, or through to initiatives that have to do with high criminal in neighborhoods, and then we have stable, peaceful developing areas where things are generally okay, but there could be some need for development related mapping. So this is how we tend to look at our context characterization when we are deciding as an organization to support a community to do mapping or to set up a mapping incidents as humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. So it's very simplified, and the reason for it is that it's largely for the community groups that we work with. So we tend to define this based off of their understanding and the easiest sort of language that would work in that context. So then we also have a process that we use for them to understand if the data is sensitive. So generally there's a set of questions. If you answer yes to any of this question, that means this is sensitive data, and the process of dealing with that data tends to differ. I think we can move on a bit. We can also move on a bit. So I'll share some examples of actual projects. And I will start with an example of an ideal mapping scenario, very uncomplicated. It's a development project, relatively no risk, and how this works in our context. So this is a county department in Kenya in a town called Nakuru. They are doing their county development plans. They need the entire city of Nakuru, which is a smaller city, mapped. So, for example, for this project, the first thing is we do not have recently updated imagery within the kind of the identified area. So we have a collaboration with Microsoft, which then provides us with recent imagery as we can get. So that supports our remote mapping process. And the first step of remote mapping is ideally just tracing buildings and roads as the core features. From there, we then go ahead to define what are the specific features, the specific attributes that are high priority in terms of the city. So this particular city is prone to flooding, has experienced lots of flooding in the last 1.5 years. Some of it is quite sporadic, some of it just moves with the weather patterns. So we then start to identify the buildings that are in areas that are really prone to flooding and what is at minimal risk of flooding. So that process itself then goes through a third process of validating that data, which is an in-person process of walk around the city using different cameras, validate which of these buildings meets the criteria that's been set up. So this is very low effort. It's further away from the emergency setting. It's a development project. There is no, let me say, rush at that particular point, and it's informed by what we call a traditional donor setting. But more and more as hot, more and more at hot, we are seeing less and less of that, and we are constantly seeing a lot more demand in terms of the humanitarian or the high-risk settings that we work in. So another example that I'll share is in Somalia, which is a solid waste mapping project. Somalia for us is an unstable setting. So the challenges there, of course, is security issues. So we cannot fly drones. We tend to use drone imagery to complement some of the satellite imagery data. We often cannot take pictures. There are security concerns with civilians, there's security policies. Of course, there's no government recognized boundaries, for lack of a better word. And there's no way we are going to go and call a government meeting and sit and discuss the optics of this with the district authorities. So in that sense, it's a very unstable setting. We are then working with a community group, an organized community group, to implement this particular project. So in that case, what do? We use remote mapping, where do we have recent imagery, satellite imagery, and then we focus group discussions to avoid just aimless wandering. Ideally, we cannot be seen walking around with our 360 cameras mapping around. The aspect of we have to use local data collectors or people that are familiar with the region. but then also the timing of this project just becomes an formal hours. So field work at 5 a.m. Just to ensure safety and avoid sort of political disruption. So that's just one example. And then so you can see the key data sets that have been collected. So it's waste collection water points, it's the dump sites, what's informal, what's formal, etc. So then Ukraine comes. So we have, this is a scenario of OSM data and active conflicts. So in this case, when I was explaining the scenario, the framework that we use to assess our intervention and whether this is high risk or low risk. So Ukraine was one of the situations where, as an organization and also from our community, we had to say, do not edit the map of Ukraine until the war is over. And the reason for this is there was just no clear reasoning that our mapping wasn't going to harm either sides or to actually perpetuate the conflict further. So in that case, on the OSM platform, on our community pages, is that no mapping should be happening within Ukraine until further notice, but in this case, it was until the end of war. But remember, we are open source. Anyone can access the map, anyone can edit the map. So there's likely that someone is going to try and edit the map, someone's going to try and edit the map. So in that case, the role of our organization or the role of active contributors or experienced mappers that we have is to actually keep watch and delete every edit that's added to the map. Again, a very hectic and manual process, but often there is no other way to around it. Then we can move forward. So we take action, we amend, we delete, etc. But then in that case, how do we support then the humanitarian response if we cannot actively support the mapping? So we can support several community initiatives in the countries sort of hosting Ukrainian refugees. We can share exposure data to climate hazards. We can do some baseline data based on whatever infrastructural data we have before the start of the war. And then at that point, it means that it's either organizations that are actively responding that will then support the evolution or the analysis of how the baseline data has been affected by the war, or whether there are any changes to that data that existed before the war. So then we had Syria. Again, where there's data we are aware of. The affected population based off of the buildings the base map data we had. In this case, we found that AI data did not significantly sort of speed up the mapping again. So we can just move on a bit. So some of the concerns, again, it's military targeting of civilian infrastructure. There could be perception of bias in mapping. Remember, we're community-led. We're not able to always reach the community. There's a reality of being personally affected by the situation as a citizen who lives in that country. So again, we'll do a review of all OSM data, balance the projects by area of influence, and then anonymize any requesting organizations that are looking to use the data that already exists. So no active mapping per se. I think this is still to do with Turkey and Syria. So for example, is an example of our overall intervention. So several projects are created in support with different organizations. We have projects that are validated through different partners. We can see the building, the areas affected in Turkey, the areas affected in Syria, etc., etc. So we're able to, at this level, the data will be very much at the buildings and roads, the first level of data. Any additional data now becomes it's actually owned by other organizations, not HOT, that are acting on that data. I think on the right you can see some data sets that are generated, and then so just to wrap up, what have we learned through the mapping in high-risk contexts. One of the things is the complexity of data. AI can slow data mapping when dealing with very high complex data. That's unstructured or that's messy data. And the reason for this is cleaning and reprocessing such data to make it understandable can be quite time consuming. And in that very active scenario, there isn't enough time to train or for different mappers to come together to go through different algorithms with our data providers. So that becomes really difficult. In instances where we have huge volumes of data to update on the map, let's say we have recent imagery that needs to get updated on a map. In that case, AI can accelerate mapping because then one of the strengths that we're able to process large data sets more quickly and then move on to validating that data. And then the third one is on data quality. We often have to confront or deal with data quality issues. So this requires a lot of human intervention. And on data quality, it really depends. It can either be aided, improvement can be aided by our AI processes, or it can be hampered by that. Just depending on the different locations or the different contexts. So as an organization, what we are looking to move towards is historically, we've really been focused on remote mapping, which is just purely buildings and roads. There is enough evidence to show that AI, more frequency opening up of satellite data could actually replace that and ensure that we're not spending that much time on the basic infrastructural mapping. But more and more organizations like HOD need to shift a lot more towards open source AI assisted mapping, which means then we are almost ensuring doing both the remote mapping and the field mapping simultaneously. So what this means is the communities then inform the models in terms of how the models are designed. And that means we're able to sort of kill two birds with one stone. So that would be an ideal scenario for us as an organization. So not shift slightly from purely remote mapping into a situation where we are combining both remote mapping and ensuring that we are feeding and informing the AI models to be able to respond to the local needs that we have. And I will stop there and see if there is any questions or any further additions.
Yes. So my questions are more